On January 26, 1983, a software company with fewer than 50 employees began selling a box of floppy disks for $495 at retail. Inside that box was a spreadsheet program written almost entirely in 8088 assembly language by a single programmer working out of a small office in Cambridge, Massachusetts. Within 9 months, that program had sold 110,000 copies. Within a year, the company behind it had revenues of $53 million against a business plan that had projected $3 to $4 million. Within 2 years, it had made the IBM personal computer the default machine on every corporate desk in America. The program was called Lotus 123, and the speed at which it conquered the American office has almost no precedent in the history of software. But the way it lost that office slowly and then all at once may be even more instructive than how it won. You're watching Tech District, where we take apart the companies that built the electronic world, down to the circuit board and the engineer who designed it. If that's your kind of story, subscribe and hit like, because the rise here is just as strange as the fall. Before there was Lotus, before there was even an IBM PC worth buying, there was a man who did not fit the profile of a software tycoon by any available measure. Mitch Kapor was born in Brooklyn, New York in 1950 and raised on Long Island. He went to Yale, where he designed his own interdisciplinary major in cybernetics, a field that blended psychology, linguistics, and computer science at a time when almost nobody had heard of it. After graduating in 1971, he drifted. He worked as a disc jockey at WHCN-FM in Hartford, Connecticut, spinning progressive rock for an audience that was probably not thinking about spreadsheets. He became a teacher of transcendental meditation, first in Cambridge, Massachusetts, then in Fairfield, Iowa. He earned a master's degree in psychology from Beacon College in Boston in 1978 and took a job as a counselor at a mental health clinic in Stoneham, Massachusetts. By the late 1970s, Mitch Kapor was nearly 30 years old, had touched half a dozen careers, and had committed to none of them. Then he bought an Apple II. The machine captivated him in a way that meditation retreats and radio booths had not. He started writing programs, small statistical tools, utilities that scratched an itch. His work caught the attention of the people behind VisiCalc, the original electronic spreadsheet, created by Dan Bricklin and Bob Frankston for the Apple II in 1979. VisiCalc was the first piece of software that made a personal computer worth buying for business purposes, and Kapor ended up writing 2 companion programs for its publisher, VisiCorp, called VisiTrend for statistical analysis and VisiPlot for business charts. He earned roughly $500,000 from those programs before selling all rights back to VisiCorp for another $1.7 million. It was a considerable sum, but the real education was not the money. It was the insight. Kapor had worked inside VisiCalc's world. He understood its interface, its limitations, and the gap between what it offered and what the emerging IBM PC could support. VisiCalc ran on the Apple II, a machine with 32 kilobytes of memory and an 8-bit processor. It was limited to a grid of about 63 columns and 254 rows. When IBM entered the personal computer market in August 1981 with a machine built around Intel's 16-bit 8088 processor and up to 256 kilobytes of RAM, the hardware landscape shifted overnight. IBM's brand gave the personal computer something it had never had before, which was corporate legitimacy. Fortune 500 purchasing departments that would never have bought an Apple II were suddenly placing orders for IBM PCs. But the machines needed software to justify the purchase, and VisiCorp moved slowly. When they finally shipped VisiCalc for the IBM PC, it was essentially a straight port of the Apple II version, barely touching the expanded hardware. It ran, but it did not take advantage of the new processor's speed or the additional memory. It felt like a small program on a bigger machine. Kapor saw the opening, and he understood something that VisiCorp apparently did not. The customers buying IBM PCs were not hobbyists. They were accountants, financial analysts, and managers who needed a tool that could handle real workloads. The program that gave them that tool would own the market. In 1979, Kapor had enrolled in the master's program at the MIT Sloan School of Management, but he dropped out before completing the degree. He would not finish it for another 46 years. In 1982, he had something more pressing than coursework. He had an idea for a product, venture capital willing to back it, and a programmer who knew how to build it. In April 1982, Kapor founded Lotus Development Corporation in Cambridge, Massachusetts, with 8 employees. His co-founder and lead programmer was Jonathan Sachs, born in Baltimore, Maryland in 1947, a quiet, methodical engineer who had earned his bachelor's degree in mathematics from MIT in 1970. Sachs had spent several years at MIT writing a programming language called Stoic, a stack-oriented interactive compiler. He had worked at Data General, one of the major mini-computer manufacturers of the era. He had co-founded Concentric Data Systems in 1979, where he built a spreadsheet inspired by VisiCalc called CompuCalc. The man knew spreadsheets at the level of machine code, and that was exactly what Kapor needed. To fund the venture, Kapor convinced Ben Rosen, a venture capitalist who had recently left Morgan Stanley to start his own firm, to invest $600,000. Other investors followed. The total initial funding reached roughly $5 million, an almost unheard of amount for a software startup at that time. Kapor believed the money was essential, not just for development, but for the advertising campaign that would precede the launch. He planned to sell the product the way consumer brands sold detergent, with wall-to-wall media coverage before a single copy reached a store shelf. The product they built together was called Lotus 123, named for the 3 things it could do, which were spreadsheet calculations, business graphics, and database management. In practice, the spreadsheet was the heart of it. The graphics and database features were useful but secondary, the kind of additions that looked good in an advertisement and justified the premium price. What made 1 or 2, 3 different from every other spreadsheet on the market? What made it faster and more reliable than products from companies with far more resources was a single engineering decision. Jonathan Sachs wrote the entire program in Intel 8088 assembly language, the native instruction set of the IBM PC's processor. Every competing spreadsheet, including VisiCalc and Microsoft's Multiplan, was written in a higher-level language, typically C. Assembly was brutally difficult to work with. It required the programmer to think in the machine's own terms, managing memory byte by byte, optimizing every loop by hand, accounting for hardware details that higher-level languages abstract away. Sachs later described it with characteristic understatement. From a programmer's standpoint, it was a mind-boggling challenge to write that much code in assembly language that fast and get it to be really solid. The team had originally started building the product in C on an Apple II with a CP/M card. Then, an IBM PC arrived at the office, and the decision was made to rewrite everything in assembly for the Intel chip. It was a gamble. It paid off completely. The finished product, Lotus 123 Release 1 for DOS, required only 192 kilobytes of RAM. It was faster than anything else available. It recalculated a full spreadsheet in a fraction of the time VisiCalc needed. It introduced a technique called natural order recalculation, which meant the program figured out the most efficient sequence to update cells on its own, rather than plotting through them from top to bottom the way earlier spreadsheets did. It was nearly bug-free, a rarity in first-release software, and it shipped with a user manual that Kapor had refined through focus groups until even non-technical users could follow it. One early focus group revealed that participants, when told to remove the protective cover and insert disk into computer, tried to tear the stiff plastic jacket off the floppy disk itself. Kapor rewrote the instructions. That instinct, the conviction that software had to serve the person sitting in front of the screen, and not just the programmer who wrote it, was as important as the assembly code underneath. Lotus spent more than $1 million on advertising in January and February of 1983 alone, placing ads in the Wall Street Journal, Businessweek, Time, Newsweek, and every major computer magazine. The product had been previewed at the Comdex trade show in Las Vegas in November 1982, and the response was immediate. Jonathan Sachs had arrived at Comdex worried that the product was too complex for its intended audience. He had brought an updated resume in his pocket, just in case the demonstration flopped. He did not need it. In the first few days after the official release, orders exceeded $1 million. By January 1983, Lotus 123 had passed VisiCalc to become the best-selling software package in the country. Byte magazine called it revolutionary instead of evolutionary. PC World called it state-of-the-art. In its first year, the company sold roughly 175,000 copies at $495 each. Revenue hit $53 million, making Lotus the second-largest software company in the world, behind only Microsoft. The original business plan's projections were off by a factor of more than 10. The company had planned for $3 to $4 million in first-year sales. It got $53 million instead. The numbers only accelerated. In 1984, Lotus revenue tripled to $157 million, and the company employed 700 people. It had gone public in October 1983, selling more than 2 million shares at $18 each and raising $41 million. By 1986, the company held 17.6% of the entire business software market and had sold 750,000 copies of 1-2-3 in that year alone, roughly 3 times as many as its nearest competitor, Microsoft's Multiplan. Lotus 1-2-3 did not merely dominate the spreadsheet market. It redefined what a personal computer was for. Before 1-2-3, the IBM PC was one machine among many in a crowded, uncertain market. After 1-2-3, corporate purchasing departments bought IBM PCs specifically to run Lotus. The spreadsheet sold the hardware. People in offices across America did not say they were working on a spreadsheet. They said they were running Lotus. Clone manufacturers used Lotus 1-2-3 alongside Microsoft Flight Simulator as the standard compatibility test. If a clone ran 1-2-3 without errors, it was considered IBM compatible. If it did not, it was considered broken. The conventions Lotus 1-2-3 established still persist in every modern spreadsheet. The cell reference system, the / key to invoke menus, the macro language that let power users automate repetitive tasks, chaining commands together in sequences that could transform a morning of manual data entry into a single keystroke. The ability to generate bar, line, and pie charts directly from spreadsheet data without leaving the program. The @sign functions that performed calculations in line, from simple sums to complex financial formulas. These were not just features. They were the grammar of a new language, and millions of office workers learned to speak it. Business schools and accounting departments across the country built their curricula around Lotus 1-2-3. Introductory finance courses assumed students would use it. Job listings in the classifieds did not ask if you knew spreadsheets. They asked if you knew Lotus. For a brief period in the mid-1980s, proficiency in 1-2-3 was not a line on a resume. It was the price of having a resume worth submitting. The sound of the program was the sound of work itself in American offices. The soft click of the / key calling up the menu bar. The brief pause while the program recalculated, and then the new numbers appearing all at once, every cell updated in a fraction of a second. No other spreadsheet could do that. For the people who used it daily, for the accountants closing the books, and the analysts building projections, that speed was not a convenience. It was the reason they had a computer on their desk at all. But Jonathan Sachs, the man who had written every line of that assembly code, the man who had built the engine that drove $53 million in first-year revenue, left Lotus in 1985. He started a small company in Cambridge called Digital Light and Color, where he developed photo editing software called Picture Window and distributed it quietly for decades. He did not become famous. He did not become a billionaire. If you ask most people who created Lotus 123, they will say Mitch Kapor. Ask them who Jonathan Sachs is, and you will get silence. Kapor himself was growing restless. He had started Lotus with an informal, almost communal management structure, but the company's explosive growth forced him into the role of corporate executive, and it was a role he found suffocating. A few years into it, I could already see that property lines were being drawn up, he later told Rolling Stone. It was turning into battles over market share. It was becoming like the detergent industry. In July 1986, at the peak of Lotus's dominance, with the company holding the largest share of the business software market and revenue climbing past $300 million annually, Mitch Kapor stepped down as CEO. He had a $6 million home on 22 acres in Brookline, Massachusetts, and access to a private jet. He did not care. Jim Manzi, who had been named president in 1984 and who possessed the appetite for corporate warfare that Kapor lacked, took full control. The founder walked away from the company he had built, just as its lead engineer had walked away the year before. By 1986, both of the people most responsible for creating Lotus 123 were gone from the company it had made. Under Manzi, Lotus tried to prove it was more than a one-product company. The proof kept failing. Symphony, an integrated software package that added word processing, data management, and networking to 123's Spreadsheet engine, launched in 1984 with a massive advertising campaign timed to the Los Angeles Olympics. Users found it cumbersome and difficult to learn. Sales were disappointing. Then came Jazz, a combined spreadsheet, database, graphics, and word processing package for the Apple Macintosh, priced at $600. Lotus invested heavily in advertising, including television spots that Kapor himself later described as like setting fire to bales of $100 bills. Jazz was buggy, slow, overpriced, and arrived 2 months behind schedule because the programmers could not get the Macintosh-compatible code to work properly. Guy Kawasaki, in his book The Macintosh Way, offered what may be the most devastating review in software history. Lotus Jazz was so bad, he wrote, even the people who pirated it returned it. In 1985, Lotus purchased Software Arts, the company that had created VisiCalc, for $800,000 plus $2.2 million in assumed debt. The spreadsheet that Lotus had dethroned was now a corpse it owned. Lotus discontinued VisiCalc immediately. These failures cost money and attention, but they were survivable as long as 123 remained dominant. The real danger was quieter, planted in the very code that had made the product great. Jonathan Sachs had written the original program in assembly language because it made 123 blindingly fast on the IBM PC's hardware. But assembly language is married to its processor. Every line of code is a specific instruction for a specific chip running a specific operating system. When the industry began shifting from text-based DOS to graphical environments in the late 1980s, that marriage became a trap. Rewriting hundreds of thousands of lines of hand-optimized assembly into C, a portable language that could target new platforms, was not an upgrade. It was demolition and reconstruction from the foundation up. Lotus understood this problem early enough to help invent a workaround for one of the IBM PC's other limitations. When the original 640 kilobytes of conventional memory was no longer enough for large spreadsheets, Lotus collaborated with Intel and Microsoft to create the expanded memory specification, known across the industry as LIM-EMS, after the initials of the three companies involved. It was a clever technical solution, but it was also a patch on a platform that was reaching its end of life. Lotus 123, Release 3, which attempted the full rewrite from assembly to C, arrived more than a year behind schedule. Then, Lotus made the bet that broke them. As DOS aged out, two graphical operating systems competed to replace it. IBM's OS/2 on one side and Microsoft's Windows on the other. Lotus, already deeply aligned with IBM, committed its development resources to OS/2. The decision looked rational at the time. IBM was the largest computer company on Earth. OS/2 was technically sophisticated. Microsoft's early Windows releases were slow, unstable, and widely dismissed. John Landry, who served as Lotus's chief technology officer in the 1990s, later called Microsoft's pivot to Windows 3.0 a head fake. But whether it was deception or simply the market choosing, the result was the same. Windows 3.0 became the dominant operating system in the world. OS/2 did not. Lotus had built its best products for a platform that almost nobody was buying. The company was cash-rich and could have developed for both OS/2 and Windows simultaneously. It chose not to. That choice was fatal. Microsoft, meanwhile, had been building Excel with patience and precision. The first version shipped for the Macintosh in 1985. The Windows version followed in 1987. Excel was designed for a graphical interface from the start, with mouse support, drop-down menus, and a visual clarity that the text-based Lotus 1-2-3 could not match. Crucially, Excel could read and write Lotus 1-2-3 files natively, which meant the cost of switching was zero. Users could move their existing spreadsheets to Excel without losing a single number. Lotus 1-2-3 for Windows, when it finally shipped in 1991, was essentially a graphical wrapper around the old DOS program. It looked like what it was, an afterthought. By the early 1990s, Excel had surpassed 1-2-3 in market share. Lotus never recovered. In parallel, Lotus fought a legal war that drained resources and alienated the industry it once led. In 1987, Borland International released Quattro, a competing spreadsheet that used a menu structure virtually identical to the Lotus 1-2-3 command hierarchy. Lotus sued in 1990, arguing that its menu tree was copyrighted expression. The case, Lotus Development Corporation versus Borland International, Incorporated, wound through the courts for 6 years. The district court sided with Lotus. The First Circuit reversed, ruling that the menu hierarchy was an uncopyrightable method of operation under copyright law. The Supreme Court heard the case in January 1996. Justice Stevens recused himself. The remaining 8 justices split evenly, 4-4, which affirmed the appeals court ruling without establishing any national precedent. Borland's CEO, Philip Kahn, had rallied the entire software development community against Lotus, arguing the company's position would cripple innovation. The vast majority of developers agreed with him. By the time the case ended, Borland had sold Quattro Pro to Novell, and Excel had already won the market. Lotus spent years and millions litigating over menu commands, while the real war, the platform war, was lost behind its back. You can read that decision 2 ways. Lotus was defending its intellectual property. Lotus was guarding a gate while the walls fell down around it. Honest history holds both readings at once. In 1995, IBM acquired Lotus Development Corporation in a hostile takeover for $3.5 billion. The price was enormous, but IBM was not buying 1-2-3. It was buying Lotus Notes, the groupware platform that by 1993 had more than 2,000 corporate customers and 500,000 users. Notes was the future IBM wanted. 1-2-3 was the past it inherited. Under IBM, Lotus 1-2-3 continued as part of the Smart Suite bundle, occasionally preloaded on corporate laptops, alongside other Lotus applications, like WordPro and freelance graphics. But the market had already decided. DOS-based spreadsheet revenue alone fell by roughly $215 million in 1993 as the market migrated to Windows. Lotus's total worldwide revenue that year was $981 million, and the desktop applications that had built the company were stagnating while communications products grew. By 1994, Windows standalone desktop application revenue was declining significantly, partially offset by growing sales of Smart Suite bundles. But it was a rearguard action. The company that had earned $53 million in its first year, a figure that seemed miraculous in 1983, was now watching its flagship product bleed revenue by multiples of that amount annually. The economics of Microsoft's Office suite made the decline structural and irreversible. Excel, Word, and PowerPoint bundled together cost less than Lotus 1, 2 to 3 had once cost by itself. A corporate buyer choosing between a $495 spreadsheet and a bundled suite that included a spreadsheet, a word processor, and a presentation program for less money was not making a difficult decision. They were making the only decision. IBM gradually removed the Lotus branding product by product, year by year. The final version of the spreadsheet, IBM Lotus 1, 2, 3 Millennium Edition, shipped without fanfare. On June 11, 2013, IBM announced it would stop marketing Lotus 1, 2, 3, Lotus Smart Suite, and Lotus Organizer. Support ended on September 30, 2014. 31 years after a box of floppy disks from Cambridge, Massachusetts had rewritten the rules of American office work, the product was gone. Mitch Kapor reached for comment, said simply, "Lotus 1, 2, 3 had a great run, and I'm proud of what we accomplished at Lotus. It was a landmark product of its era." In 2018, IBM sold what remained of the Lotus portfolio, primarily notes and related groupware, to HCL Technologies for $1.8 billion. The company IBM had bought for $3.5 billion was sold for roughly half that, and virtually all of the remaining value was in the messaging platform. The spreadsheet was worth nothing at all, but software does not die the way hardware does. Hardware corrodes, its capacitors leak, its solder joints crack. Software waits, frozen in whatever state it last compiled, ready to run again if someone builds it a bridge to new hardware. In May 2022, a security researcher named Tavis Ormandy, who hunts software vulnerabilities at Google Project Zero during business hours, posted a blog entry that opened with a joke. "It's an exciting time in the Lotus 1, 2, 3 enthusiast community." Then the punchline. "That was a joke. There is no enthusiast community, it's just me." Ormandy had been tinkering with Lotus 1, 2 to 3 for years, maintaining a custom display driver for Dosimo that let the old DOS version run on modern terminals. But this was different. He had discovered, buried in the archives of a 1990s bulletin board system, Juarez scene material that included an unlinked object file from a rare 1990 Unix port of Lotus 1, 2, 3 for x86, a version originally intended for SCO Unix. The file had shipped unstripped, meaning it still contained its original debugging symbols, a map of the program's internal structure that should have been removed before distribution. Using that file, a 30-year-old Lotus software development kit unearthed from the same archive, and a custom display driver he wrote from scratch, Ormandy ported Lotus 1, 2, 3 to run natively on modern Linux. Not emulated, not virtualized. The original machine code, adapted to Linux system calls, relinked against modern libraries, and launched in a terminal window. He bypassed the license check, but he owns a boxed copy of Lotus 1, 2, 3 for MS-DOS, so the legal ground is arguably solid. Ormandy published the project on GitHub. It compiles. It runs. You can download it today, open a terminal on a machine running the latest Linux kernel, and type numbers into the same grid that accountants at Fortune 500 companies stared at in 1984. The cells still recalculate fast. Mitch Kapor used the fortune Lotus made him to pursue the causes he cared about. In 1990, he co-founded the Electronic Frontier Foundation. He became the first chair of the Mozilla Foundation. He taught at the MIT Media Lab and at the University of California, Berkeley. Then, in 2025, 46 years after dropping out of the MIT Sloan School of Management, he went back, completed his coursework, wrote a thesis, and finally earned his master's degree. He was 74 years old. When a colleague teased him about the gap on his transcript, Kapor agreed it was time to close it. Jonathan Sachs, the man who had actually written Lotus 1, 2, 3, continued running digital light and color out of Cambridge, quietly distributing Picture Window, his photo editing software, to a small user base that appreciated his craftsmanship. He did not start a foundation. He did not become a public figure. He wrote another piece of software, a careful one, and kept refining it. If you owned a copy of Lotus 123, if you worked on one, or if you worked at Lotus Development Corporation during the years when it mattered, drop a comment below. Tell us the version, the year, and whether anything has ever recalculated a column that fast. The people who used these programs and the people who built them know more about what was lost than the people who sold them. We have the story of another American software empire coming next, and you will not want to miss how it ends. If the channel is new to you, it is called Tech District.